start sharing your presentation. Hello everyone, I'm not sure if Spinoza is here, but I will introduce Medi, Mirak. Can you mute yourself, Medi, for just a second? Yeah, because there is an echo. Oh, Spinoza is there.
Yes, then I'm pleased to welcome Medi Mirak. He is an associate professor of software engineering and Kodak Endowed Scholar at Rochester Institute of Technology. He is the founding director of Software Design and Productivity Laboratory and a member of the Global Cybersecurity Institute at the RIT. His research interests are on the intersection of software engineering and cybersecurity, and he has served as the PI on grant worth of over $5 million. Dr. Macaulay serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Software and Systems, JSS, and the IEEE transaction in software engineering. And he is a recipient of the NSF Career Award and multiple distinguished Best Paper Awards. So I really look forward to give you the floor, Medi. So please take over the microphone.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to be in this workshop and share the results of some of my research. Today, I'm gonna talk about secure by design, what it means and what it takes. Before that, let me tell you a little bit about myself. What do I do for a living? I live in Rochester, New York. We have 6 months of snow here, so you can imagine my daily activities start with shoveling the snow and opening the driveway. I'm a member of Global Cybersecurity Institute at RIT. Here we perform both basic and applied research in software engineering, cybersecurity. In particular, our type of research is based on industry and university collaborative research. We carry out empirical studies with industrial partner, identify best practices and pain points for them. Then we build tools and techniques that could support them and enhance programmers and developers' productivities in their daily activities. I want to start by talking about economic aspects of software security and finding ways that we could actually price security, how much security costs our economy. If you look at the news and media over last decades, there have been many incidents of cyber incidents, starting, for example, with Stuxnet malware attack on Iranian nuclear facility, or recently SolarWinds vulnerability that did shake US government in terms of the impact of that attack, or Equifax data breach, Heartbleed, and so on. And if you look at the media, there are many news about ransom attacks that attackers have leveraged weaknesses in software systems and requested ransom to give access back to the users, to the victims. I wanted to do a little research and find a way of measuring the impacts of some of these cyber vulnerabilities. For instance, I chose Equifax software and I looked at one way of measuring the impact of cyber incidents in Equifax, and that was based on looking at their stock market. Of course, that's one way of measuring the economical impacts. It may not be comprehensive, but let's look at what happened. In March 8, 2017, researchers report security flaw in software used in Equifax website. Equifax website was using Apache Struts. That was an open source library that was vulnerable. In May 13th, hackers leveraged this flaw to break into Equifax customer dispute portal. Then in July 29th, the same year, Equifax notices suspicious network traffic and blocks it. In August 2nd, company brings in outside cyber investigators. In August 22, company registers the new domain name equifaxsecurity2017.com, and in September 7, Equifax announces breach impacting about 143 million US customers. And these are mostly people that have mortgages or home loans that use this website. In September 15th, company says that security intrusion ran from May 13th to July 30th. In 10 days, Equifax's stock value shrunk by about $6 billion in 10 days. Is that an economical impact of software security? Maybe in some way it captures it. It doesn't capture the impact on individuals, victims, or users of this website, this service. At the time, I noticed when I continued looking into how much was the economical impact of this single vulnerability, I noticed that there were reports that Equifax actually at the time had a 125 million cybersecurity insurance policy with 7.5 million deductible, and the company came out and mentioned that actually they managed to get maximum reimbursement. Their stock also to some extent recovered. But that doesn't mean that Equifax breach cost company nothing. 2 years after the breach, the company basically they spent 1.4 billion on cleanup cost. That includes incremental cost to transform their technology infrastructure, improve their application network, and data security. That's one single vulnerability in an open source library that was used by Equifax that had such impact. Recently, there was another cyber incident in the Colonial Pipeline. That was a gas and pipeline facility in Texas that hackers basically took over this facility and they asked for ransom. In May 13th, it came out that actually the company paid hackers nearly 5 million to take over the control of their own facility. And that was the time that due to this attack, the price of gas increased in the state. Many gas stations were out of the gas. There were other stories on May 2021 this year. CNA Financial paid 40 million in ransom after a cyber attack that happened in March. There are many incidents like that. In 2018, the Council of Economic Advisors to White House put a report together on the cost of malicious cyber activities on U.S. economy. This report indicates that malicious cyber activities cost just U.S. economy between 57 billion to 109 billion in 2016. On average, cyber attack costs small companies 200K, putting many of them out of business. That's one way of looking at the cost of pricing security when we look at the cost of security post incidents, when cyber incidents occurs. There is another way of looking at the same cost of security is when the effort that we put into making systems secure. I looked up some numbers. If you the cost of detecting a single vulnerability and fixing a vulnerability at the production or post-release time could be $14,000 just detecting a single one. This cost is much less if the effort for hunting the vulnerability and fixing that happens earlier in the development cycle, such as acceptance testing, integration testing, or coding or software design. During the software design, that cost can be the cost of mitigating a vulnerability. Putting security controls in place to mitigate the vulnerability could be as low as $139. Secure by Design aims to shift the main focus of software assurance from finding security bugs to identifying flaws and weaknesses in the design. In this paradigm, the security is built in the system from the ground up and start with this robust security architecture design. I mentioned security architecture design. Let's put a working example, what do we mean by security architecture design? Here is an example of an architecture for Hadoop. It's a parallel computing platform. You see, things that you expect to see in an architecture diagram. There are components that are shown as boxes, databases, connection between these components. Any element that you see in this diagram has a reason. Those reasons are requirements. For example, the stakeholders of this project wanted to have a system that is highly available, where hardware failure can be the norm rather than exceptions. To satisfy these requirements, designers came with a set of design decisions. For example, they used master-slave architectural style, where slave processes were replicated. They used checkpointing to synchronize between replicated processes. They use heartbeat architectural solution to monitor availability of the components, such as task tracker and data node. Heartbeat must beat every 0.25 seconds to balance availability and performance. They use proxy architectural style to handle failure and shield clients from the failures. Here's another example of a requirements that stakeholders wanted to provide secure services for the clients. To satisfy that requirements, designers made a set of design decisions. For example, they chose mutual authentication with Kerberos on RPC connections. They decided to maintain an audit trail of activities within the system. They performed data encryption on RPC, data encryption on block data transfer, data encryption on HTTP, and also they implement a secure data node in a way that data nodes must authenticate themselves in addition to the users being authenticated. If we look at any non-trivial architecture, it is likely that it is composed of hundreds of such design decisions, if not thousands. So when we talk about security architecture, we are talking about a collection of design decisions that are made to make the system secure. Where do we get these design decisions? They're often based on security tactics or security controls that are used to detect attack, resist against attack, react to attack, or recover from attack. For example, to recover from attack, designers often choose audit trail to keep track of activities within the system. To resist attack, designers use security tactics or security controls such as identify actor, perform input validation, manage user sessions, authorize access, limit access, and so on to make the system more secure. In secure by design, architecture is the main and the first step to secure the system. It starts by identifying misuse cases, abuse cases, performing threat modeling, then making a set of design decisions to mitigate threats. Since architecture is the core of secure by design, weaknesses in the architecture of the system can have a great impact. If there is a flaw in the architecture of the system, then there is a backdoor in the system. What are the differences between architectural flaws and bugs? We might be familiar with the bugs. There are code level issues such as incorrect typecast, like on the left side of the screen. Then we have architectural flaws that there are deeper level issues with deeper root causes. For example, client-side authentications. Designers decide to make a system secure, but their authentication logic is implemented on the client side, which means the authentication module, the code for the authentication is running on the client side on the hacker's machine. So attackers may have a mechanism to reverse engineer the authentication logic or bypass it, and therefore gain access to the server, the data, and the processes. If the authentication mechanism was on the server side, hackers did not have access to that logic. That's just one example, but what are common architectural flaws? In our research, we wanted to investigate what are the common design flaws that happens. There have been a lot of work in the literature about secure coding practices, coding issues, detecting coding vulnerabilities. But we wanted to see what are common design mistakes that could happen in different systems. We started learning from vulnerabilities in real system. We study focused on top 20 vulnerable systems, and these were open source, so we could access their source code and review their source code. We looked at national vulnerability data set, a database that was maintained by National Institute of Technology and Standard and Department of Homeland Security. That was a database of known and disclosed vulnerabilities. We looked at other resources such as MITRE Corporation, Common Weakness Enumerations that describe common software weaknesses and other resources about software vulnerabilities. We analyze each individual vulnerabilities reported in National Vulnerability Database. Here is an example of that. We performed open coding. We looked at what is the root cause of the vulnerability. We manually investigated them. We coded them to see if they could be design related or coding related. We went through an intensive review of real vulnerabilities in National Vulnerability database, and we established a catalog of these different design vulnerabilities. Our catalog captures 224 security issues rooted in software architecture. The catalog is organized based on different security controls or security tactics. Each security file, what could go wrong if you have that design security control? What are the type of weaknesses you could have? For example, if you use audit trail to keep track of activities, one issue that could happen that you may not sanitize the log that you write the data to. You may not sanitize the output log. This catalog, when we analyzed it, we realized that design vulnerabilities can be of different types. Sometimes they are omission type. These are decisions that were never made. Developers, designers forgot to make certain security design decisions. For example, password is stored without encryptions. The system used authentication, but the designers didn't have any security controls related to encryption of credentials. That was omission type vulnerable weaknesses. Then the other type of design weaknesses were commission. These were poor design decisions, meaning that designers made architectural decisions, but their design decision was not appropriate for the situation. Example, client-side authentication that I explained. Other design weaknesses were cases that architects made appropriate design decisions, but the implementation of those design decisions were incorrect. For example, they had authentication, they used proper authentication controls, but when the developers implemented them, their code was vulnerable to authentication bypass. Certain components, methods were accessible without going through authentication. The catalog organizes design weaknesses based on 12 security architectural concepts that we used here, security tactics or security controls as a way of organizing the design weaknesses. Right now is accessible on MITRE Corporation website and is used under architectural concept. These are different architectural concepts and weaknesses associated to them are listed. Let's look at a couple of examples here. If you look at authenticate actor security tactic, you would see several weaknesses common weaknesses that could happen if designers choose to use authenticate actor. Sometimes designers use authenticate actor, but when that design decision is implemented, programmers use hard-coded credentials. They do not use password aging. They do not use expirations and so on. Here is another example, detailed examples of a design weakness that is a commission type design weakness, is that the system relies on IP address for authentication. IP address can be, this is a design flaw, IP address can be easily spoofed attackers can forge the source of IP address of the packet they send, but the response packet will be returned to the forged IP address. So that's not the right way of authenticating user, one of the design weaknesses in our catalog. Here is another design weakness that is more realization type weakness, that the design decision is correct, by implementation of that is incorrect. Manage user session tactic can be used. Here's a code snippet that shows manage user session tactic is used. Login method has been executed, a session has been established, but prior to establishing the session is not invalidated. This type of design weaknesses, especially related to calling APIs, result in vulnerabilities such as session fixation attack. Are design vulnerabilities common? We wanted to investigate how frequently design weaknesses happens in different systems. We started to look at 3 open source products. These are among vulnerable open source products that have a significant number of disclosed vulnerabilities. We got in touch with the architects and designers of these systems. We interviewed them. We documented how they made this system secure. We traced their design decisions, security decisions to the source code to identify where their design decisions are identified. But also we collected the CVEs, vulnerability disclosure, for these systems from National Vulnerability Database. We mapped the CVEs to issue tracking systems. We identified patches that used to fix the CVEs. We traced the patches to the source files, and we managed to establish a connection between vulnerabilities, files, and design decisions. Then, through a peer review, our team reviewed all these vulnerabilities, cross-validated them, and classified them to vulnerabilities that were tactical or architectural, and vulnerabilities that happen with no design consequences or root causes. For example, buffer overflow versus a session fixation vulnerability. The analysis of this experiment showed that in Chromium, 42% of vulnerabilities were architectural. That's about 403 CVEs, disclosed vulnerabilities. And in PHP and Thunderbird, that was around 38% of vulnerabilities. There have been other reports that indicate overall more than 50% of vulnerabilities in systems are design-related vulnerabilities. Among these architectural design-related vulnerabilities, the majority of them were related to input validation, when either the systems lacked proper input validation and sanitization of the input, or they had an improper implementation of it. And second, architectural tactic or security control impacted by these vulnerabilities were related to authorized actor. Often, we adopt these security tactics to make systems more secure, but one issue that we observed in this study was that even when designers adopted these security control, security tactics, programmers struggled, and there were concerns about how these security controls were implemented that enabled certain types of attacks to be viable. And if you compare these type of weaknesses with the weakness, let's say, buffer overflow. When a buffer overflow happens in a system, hackers will have access to a part of the memory. In that part of memory, it could be users' credentials, or it could be garbage. It could be information that is not useful for the hackers. But when bypass of authentication, for example, happens, hackers have access to all the processes and the data in the system without going through the authentication. So the impact is more significant. That was one study. In the next empirical study, we wanted to see if these design vulnerabilities are common, what design vulnerabilities are common in industrial control systems. Entirely different domain. Industrial control systems are used for critical infrastructure. They are used in manufacturing, nuclear facilities, oil and gas production, transportation, and so on. Vulnerabilities in industrial control system became popular when the Stuxnet vulnerability came out, when Iranian nuclear facility was impacted by a malware that was a malware that affected Siemens PLC, programmable logic controller. Since then, a lot of attention came toward industrial control system, their safety and security concerns. Um, Attacks to ISIS infrastructures have exponentially increased from a few to hundreds per year. Security is a key concern in these systems. Attacks can affect regional or national safety and economics. The system cannot be easily taken offline for updating or patching the system. Actually, there are concerns about how could you patch industrial control system with no downtime. So security is a real concern for these systems. Uh, we work with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, National Institute of Technology, U.S. Cyber Emergency Response Team, and we analyze vulnerabilities that were disclosed for industrial control system. We put a reference architecture for industrial control system. That was by studying various industrial control system. This is a very abstract model of that reference architecture. Here we have PLCs, remote terminal units that are connected to the sensors and actuators in the field. We have using industrial communication protocol such as field bus. Then ISIS infrastructure often has HMI that are used by humans to configure the plans, troubleshoot the problems, run, stop, and update programs, and recover from failures. We have data historian. Data historian is a module that logs daily operational data used for analysis and diagnosis. We worked with our partners. We looked at advisory reports. So each vendor that produce an industrial control system often maintains a security advisory, or otherwise US government maintain that they report security issues in their product. Here is an example of advisory report from ICS CERT that collects these vulnerability or security advisory reports and disclose them. You see an overview that basically there have been a vulnerability in Rockwell automation PLC. It identified which version of that PLC was vulnerable, what was the impact of that, what hackers could do given this vulnerability, which CWE was the root cause of the vulnerability. Here, for example, the ICS, the PLC was vulnerable because it was transferring sensitive information in a clear text. So there was a mapping to the CWs. So we analyze all the vulnerabilities that were ever reported for industrial control system. We mapped them to the catalog of design weaknesses that we had, and we wanted to know how often those design weaknesses actually occur in the vulnerabilities that are reported by advisories. The results showed that actually 62% of ISIS advisories were associated with at least one architectural weakness. HMI had the highest number of vulnerabilities, and one reason was that modern HMI are using a lot of web-based solutions and therefore suffer from issues related to web-based vulnerabilities. Second component was SCADA, and third one was PLC. And we looked at tactics that were impacted. Input validation was one of them, and many of the root causes were related to improper input validation, cross-site request forgery, or often use of hard-coded credentials, use of hard-coded password, insufficiently protected credentials, and so on. The lesson learned from the study was that majority of ICS vendors actually do not follow secure by design concept. They are insecure by design. We looked at the responses of the vendors, and often when they disclose the vulnerability, they mention that our products are designed to be used in a protected environment and therefore do not have the mitigation technique, either authentication or input validation, to require to work in untrusted environments. So basically, they took the responsibility to the consumers that you cannot have this in an unprotected environment. Your network system needs to be isolated, attack surfaces needs to be closed. Some of the implication for practitioners: isolate control system devices and system from untrusted networks, sanitize user inputs to ICS component and devices, encrypt sensitive data, secure ICS endpoints, follow a tactic-centric approach to ICS security, and use protected network environment for unpatched devices. But I talked about secure by design, but what it takes to achieve a secure by design solution. The first step, we need to start by looking at the requirements. Secure by design, we cannot separate design from the requirements. We need to start with robust, security requirements engineering. We need to look at use cases, identify misuse cases and abuse cases. For example, here, we might have a use case as register customer, then there are abuse cases that hackers can leverage, that is, for example, flood the system through that use case or remove a customer through that use case. In a project with an industrial partner, what we are building an automated technique that analyzes requirements and specification in natural language format, synthesize the requirements, leverages a formal reasoning engine that reasons about attacks, misuse cases, and abuse cases, and then generate attack scenarios. Or technology converts natural language requirements into a formal specification, then perform the reasoning to identify potential attack scenarios and generates an attack scenario model, and maps the attacks in that attack scenario model to CAPEC, that are common attack patterns captured by Mirak Corporation. That's how much I managed to get permission to share about. But when we do start secure by design by focusing on requirements, identifying misuse cases and abuse cases, next is to carry that on also to the next phase, which is building the design models. There are certain domains that we actually have design models. There are other domains that design models are tacit. All we have is a set of source code or maybe some documentation. In this project, we focused on making sure that analyzing design models using AI and model checking techniques to make sure if design vulnerabilities exist in those systems or don't. Our approach, that was a paper that my PhD student Joanna presented in the same workshop last year, leverages on assurance cases for architectural model and checks if secure by design claims are met. Basically, for each item in the catalog of design vulnerability that we have generated an abstract and generic assurance case model. Given that assurance case model, you could annotate your system with the roles. For example, you could say, "This, what you see here, is an AADL model of a given system. Here is the visual model of it. Behind, we have AADL model, which is architecture description language." We augment this model with the assurance cases that we have developed. And our assurance cases are written in an assurance case language called Resolute. Here you see a Resolute statement that says, check for CAWE20. CAWE20 was a design flaw related to input validation, improper input validation. Then the rules that will be executed for claims that we want to check for this assurance case is that Does the system has an input validator component? Yes or no? If there is no input validation logic implemented in the models, then this flaw is relevant. If there is an input validation component implemented, our next claim is to check for every single entry point in the system that the system interacts with outsiders. We check if that communication goes through sanitization and input validation or not. So there is a reachability analysis here performed that we look at every component that is reachable through the entry points to see if they go through that input validation or not. So that's kind of way of designing a system, performing requirements engineering, security requirements engineering, getting to the design step and validating if the design models, um, analyzing the design models and validating if the design is secure or not, or certain design vulnerabilities exist or not. In this project, we have developed numerous assurance cases that are generic, can be used across different systems. In particular, uh, we require to have OSATA modeling environment that you could write uh, AADL specifications. When we go from design, there are environment that there is no design model similar, unlike the previous situation that I described. Then often the design is implemented in the code. Designers have an intended architecture in mind, but what is implemented in the code is significantly different from the intended architecture. We often call that architectural drift, that implemented architecture is not the same as intended architecture. We had some studies that have difficulties implementing architectural tactics and the style. They keep refactoring them, but at the end, they don't get them implemented correctly. Or initial analysis showed that actually when programmers implemented security tactics, they had significantly more bugs in the implementation of those tactics compared to the functional pieces of the software. Uh, Basically, the system started with a nice modular architecture. After a few releases, it was a big ball of mud. This is Hadoop's architecture before and after. It's a big ball of mud, not because it's circle, because all the files are interconnected. The architecture is eroded. What we did in Hadoop and other systems, we wanted to see why developers struggled with implementing these design decisions. We established a contribution matrix for developers. We looked at who contributes to what code snippets, and these are code snippets related to different security tactics like authentication, audit trail, role-based access control. We got the email address of these developers. We kind of spied on them from LinkedIn. We extracted information from them, and we created these design profiles that captures who these developers are. Some commit messages, years of experience, and so on. We created these profiles for every developer. We divided developers into architecture savvy and non-architecture savvy. And our analysis showed that actually non-architecture savvy tend to introduce more bugs in the design fragment of the systems. And design fragments owned by architecture savvy developers are less likely to have bugs. It kind of demonstrated actually developers struggle in transitioning from design to the code, especially implementing security controls. Developers that were security savvy introduced less bugs. It highlighted the need for building tools and techniques that could help developers implement security design decisions. To have a secure by design, we need to look at the implementation of security design decisions in the code. Detecting design flaws in the code is actually difficult. I'm going to just have one slide about it, not to get into details. And one reason is that each flaw is entirely different than the other one. It would be very difficult to build a static dynamic analysis technique that detects many of them. Many of the existing static dynamic analysis tools actually only detect code level vulnerabilities, not design level vulnerabilities. So that's an opportunity for research. Another area to pay attention when we deal with secure by design is securing the APIs. Now APIs are more often used in system, RESTful APIs, commercial off-the-shelf product, open source libraries. Attackers are shifting their focus from traditional buffer overflow type weaknesses to abusing software APIs. For example, USPS, US Postal Service in US, had serious API weaknesses. If someone logged into the USPS.com, they could have abused the APIs to get all information about the users or even manipulate and modify their account information. In one project, we wanted to see if we could support programmers in properly implementing APIs. We worked on an approach based on learning by example. We wanted to see if we could learn by example to infer API specifications that tell us what is the correct way of using the API, then use those specifications to detect misuse cases, abuse cases of the APIs. Our approach consumes the framework source code. If you're using a particular API, the source code of the API, if it's a third party, let's say Java authentication authorization service, Jazz, that provides authentication functionality, and some tutorials and sample projects that use that API. We analyze both. From the project, we identify how the API can be used. From the framework, we identify if the usage of those APIs in the sample projects were correct or incorrect. And as a result, we capture correct usage of the APIs. Through a learning technique, we identify all the possible ways that APIs can be used. Then we use that to recommend developers if they have API misuses or incorrect implementation. Here's an example of the tool. Login functionality was implemented in Jazz. We analyze our tool and we identify, yes, this is an area that a method call was missing, or if there are other form of misuses, our technique will detect that. Developers struggle with implementing security controls. Do we think testing could help? And there's a lot of emphasis on shift left. Can we unit test security controls? For example, can we test for weak password policy? Is the user one test case could be, is the user prevented from using his username or account information in the password? Is this unit testable? How do we set up the test? What action and expected outcome? We interviewed testers. We performed analysis of numerous test cases were written to test authentication mechanism, and we came up with a set of cheat sheets that could help developers to figure out how they could test their authentication security control, for example, if it is unit testable, and if they wrote unit test, how the unit test needs to look like. That kind of could serve as a cheat sheet for many developers that they could examine their authentication to detect security issues or what flaws early on. There's a lot of resources on how you do unit testing. How do you test functional requirements? But there are not enough resources. How do you test security controls? This work in particular focused on authentication security control. We looked at different modules, for example, login, logout, refresh token, token authentication, token manipulation. What are the set of test cases that can be developed? For example, scenarios. Token passed to the authenticator. Is token valid? If it's valid, the expected outcome should be authentication process. We put all of this together. We created a cheat sheet that for each component of the authentication describes what needs to be done. It organized based on scenarios. Scenarios are written in natural language, and that can be used by programmers as a resource to perform early testing of security controls that they have in their design and make sure that their implementation is flawless. Our focus is on a common, part of our research focuses on common architectural weaknesses. This work is mainly sponsored by Department of Homeland Security, National Science Foundation, DARPA, US Air Force, and other industrial collaborators. We focus on detecting omission risks in the code, detecting commission risks in the code, as well as a commission risk in the design, and detecting realization, which are